In the scorching heat of Arizona territory, where the desert wind carries the scent of sage and the echoes of ancient wars, a woman with gentle hands and an iron will make a choice that would forever change the course of two worlds colliding. Sarah Mitchell, a skilled nurse with nothing left to lose, dedicated 7 years of her life to healing the wounds of Apache, warriors who had every reason to distrust her people. But when one brave offered her something unimaginable in return, she discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1881 brought an uneasy quiet to Fort Carson, Arizona territory, where Sarah Mitchell pressed a cool cloth to the fevered brow of another wounded soldier. At 24, she had already seen more suffering than most people witness in a lifetime. The cramped infirmary reeked of carbolic acid and desperation, its whitewashed walls stained with the evidence of countless battles between cavalry and Apache forces that seemed to rage endlessly across the red desert landscape. Sarah wasn't supposed to be here. The daughter of a Pennsylvania doctor who had died of consumption 3 years earlier, she had come west with dreams of establishing a proper medical practice in California. Those dreams had crumbled when her stagecoach was attacked by bandits outside Tucson, leaving her stranded with nothing but her medical bag and the clothes on her back. The cavalry patrol that found her brought her to Fort Carson, where Dr. William Hayes, the overwhelmed army surgeon, had practically begged her to stay. Now, as she moved between cots filled with wounded soldiers, Sarah couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the care given to different patients. The white soldiers received proper beds, clean linens, and regular meals. In the back corner of the infirmary, separated by a hastily constructed wooden partition, lay 3 Apache prisoners who had been brought in more dead than alive after the latest skirmish at Copper Ridge. The Apache men lay on straw mattresses placed directly on the dirt floor. Their wounds had been roughly bandaged, but infection was already setting in on the eldest warrior, whose shoulder bore a festering bullet wound. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle from where his horse had fallen on him during the fighting. Between them lay a man of perhaps 30 years, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths, multiple knife wounds across his torso, slowly bleeding through inadequate dressings. Dr. Hayes emerged from his small office, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron. His gray hair was disheveled, and deep lines of exhaustion marked his weathered face. He had been the fort's only medical officer for 8 years, and the constant stream of casualties was wearing him down to nothing. "Sarah," he called, his voice hoarse from fatigue. "I need you to check on the men in Ward 2. Private Morrison is showing signs of fever, and Corporal Jenkins is complaining of chest pains again." Sarah nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the partition separating the Apache prisoners. "Doctor, what about the wounded prisoners?" "The older man's shoulder is badly infected." Dr. Hayes followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Those are enemy combatants, Miss Mitchell. Our priority is our own men. They're human beings," Sarah replied quietly. "And that infection will spread to gangrene if it's not treated properly." "That's not our concern," Dr. Hayes said firmly, though something in his eyes suggested the callousness didn't come naturally to him. "Captain Stone's orders are clear. We provide basic care to keep them alive for questioning, nothing more." Sarah had met Captain Robert Stone only once, when she first arrived at Fort Carson. He was a man carved from granite, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to see every Apache as a threat to be eliminated, rather than human beings caught in an impossible situation. His hatred ran deep, fueled by the loss of his younger brother in an Apache raid 5 years earlier. As Dr. Hayes returned to his rounds, Sarah found herself repeatedly glancing toward the partition. The soft moaning of the wounded Apache men seemed to echo louder than the complaints of the soldiers. She had taken an oath to heal, not to discriminate based on the color of a patient's skin or which flag they served under. That evening, after Dr. Hayes had retired to his quarters and the fort had settled into its nightly routine, Sarah made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She gathered clean bandages, antiseptic solution, and a small lantern, then quietly made her way to the Apache prisoners. The oldest warrior was delirious with fever, his weathered face flushed and hot to the touch. Sarah carefully removed his crude bandages, revealing a wound that was indeed dangerously infected. Working by lamplight, she cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied fresh antiseptic, and rebandaged it properly. The man barely stirred during the procedure, his breathing shallow but steady. The youngest warrior watched her with wide, dark eyes that held a mixture of fear and confusion. His leg was clearly broken in multiple places, but no attempt had been made to set the bones properly. Sarah knew she couldn't do the necessary surgery without Dr. Hayes' knowledge, but she could at least immobilize the limb properly and ease the boy's pain. It was when she turned to the middle warrior that Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Even unconscious and wounded, there was something compelling about this man. His features were strong and noble, with high cheekbones and a jaw set with determination. Even in sleep, his long black hair was matted with blood and dust, but she could see silver threads woven through it in intricate patterns that suggested high rank among his people. His wounds were numerous, but not as life-threatening as those of his companions. As Sarah cleaned and dressed each cut, she noticed the intricate tattoos that adorned his chest and arms, telling stories and symbols she couldn't read but somehow found beautiful. His hands, even in their injured state, showed the calluses of a warrior and horseman, but also a surprising gentleness in their shape. "What are you doing?" Sarah nearly dropped her lantern at the sound of the voice. She spun around to find Lieutenant James Parker standing at the edge of the partition, his young face a mask of concern and confusion. Unlike Captain Stone, Parker was new to the frontier, fresh from West Point with ideals that hadn't yet been hardened by years of warfare. "Providing medical care," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "These men are suffering unnecessarily. Captain Stone will have you court-martialed if he finds out," Parker warned, though he made no move to stop her. "These are the enemy, Miss Mitchell." "These are wounded men," Sarah corrected, turning back to her patient. "And I'm not a soldier. Lieutenant, I'm a nurse. My duty is to heal, not to judge." Parker was silent for a long moment, watching as Sarah continued her work. "The one in the middle," he said finally. "Do you know who he is?" Sarah looked up from her bandaging. "Should I?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His name is Joseph Crowfeather. He's the son of Chief Running Bear, leader of one of the most powerful Apache bands in the territory. Captain Stone has been trying to capture him for 2 years. The information sent a chill through Sarah, but she continued her work. "Then he's fortunate to be alive. For now," Parker said grimly. "Stone wants him conscious for interrogation. After that." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. When Sarah completed her clandestine medical rounds, she returned to her small quarters behind the infirmary, but sleep eluded her. The image of Joseph Crowfeather's face haunted her thoughts, along with the knowledge of what awaited him once he recovered enough to face Captain Stone's questioning. The next morning brought troubling news. During the night, an Apache war party had attacked a supply wagon 20 miles south of the fort, killing 2 drivers and making off with medical supplies and ammunition. Captain Stone was in a rage, pacing the parade ground like a caged animal, his plans for retribution already taking shape. "They're testing us," he snarled to his assembled officers, "seeing how we'll respond to having their war chief's son in custody. Well, they're about to learn that Robert Stone doesn't negotiate with savages." Dr. Hayes pulled Sarah aside after. The captain's tirade. "I want you to stay away from the Apache prisoners," he said quietly. "Stone is looking for any excuse to make an example, and I won't have you caught in the crossfire." "Doctor," the older man's fever broke during the night. "With proper care, he might survive. And the boy's leg could heal properly if we set it correctly." "Sarah," Dr. Hayes' voice carried a warning. "These men are not your responsibility. Focus on our soldiers." But Sarah couldn't focus on anything else. Throughout the morning, as she tended to the routine ailments of the garrison, her thoughts returned again and again to the 3 Apache warriors lying in the dirt-floored section of the infirmary. The oldest man had indeed survived the night, his fever dropping thanks to the proper wound care she had provided. The youngest was alert but clearly in significant pain from his improperly healed leg. And Joseph Crow Feather had begun showing signs of consciousness, his eyelids fluttering and his breathing becoming more regular. It was mid-afternoon when Sarah heard the commotion from the Apache section of the infirmary. She rushed to the partition to find Captain Stone standing over Joseph Crow Feather, who had regained consciousness and was attempting to sit up despite his injuries. "So the famous war chief's son awakens," Stone said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your people killed 2 more white men last night. What do you have to say about that?" Joseph's dark eyes focused on Stone with surprising clarity given his condition. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "I say that your people have been killing mine for generations. 2 deaths are nothing compared to the hundreds of Apache children who have died from your bullets and your diseases." Stone's face flushed with anger. "You're in no position to lecture me about justice, Savage. Your raiding days are over." "My raiding days?" Joseph attempted to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "I have killed in battle, yes. But I have never attacked civilians, never harmed women or children. Can your soldiers say the same?" The accusation hit its mark. Sarah knew that several recent cavalry actions had resulted in Apache casualties that included non-combatants, a fact that troubled even some of the hardened officers. "You'll answer for every white death in this territory," Stone threatened, leaning closer to Joseph. "Before I'm finished with you, you'll beg to tell me where your father's stronghold is hidden." Joseph's response was to meet Stone's glare with unflinching dignity. "A man can only die once, Captain. How I die will determine whether I bring honor or shame to my ancestors." Stone's hand moved to his sidearm, but Lieutenant Parker stepped forward. "Sir, perhaps we should wait until the prisoner is stronger before beginning formal questioning." For a moment, Sarah thought Stone might strike the young lieutenant. Instead, he spun on his heel and stalked from the infirmary, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press against the walls. Joseph's eyes found Sarah standing near the partition. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the divide of culture, language, and the brutal realities of frontier warfare. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "You are the woman who cleaned my wounds." It wasn't a question, and Sarah realized she had been discovered. "I'm a nurse," she replied simply. "It's what I do. It is not what the others do." Joseph's gaze shifted to his 2 wounded companions. The old man, Grey Wolf, says his fever dreams were filled with gentle hands that drove away the fire in his blood. The boy, Standing Horse, can move his leg without screaming now. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. Any trained medical professional would have done the same, would they? Joseph studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You risk punishment from your own people to ease the suffering of your enemies. This is not the action of just any medical professional." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Hayes appeared at her elbow. "Miss Mitchell, I need your assistance with Private Henderson. He's taken a turn for the worse." As Sarah reluctantly followed the doctor away from the partition, she felt Joseph's gaze following her. Something had shifted in that brief exchange, a recognition that transcended the bitter divisions of the Apache wars. She didn't yet understand what it meant, but she sensed that her life at Fort Carson was about to become far more complicated. That evening, as Sarah prepared for another secret visit to the Apache prisoners, she found Lieutenant Parker waiting for her outside the infirmary. "I won't try to stop you," he said without preamble. "But I want you to understand what you're getting into. Captain Stone suspects you're providing unauthorized care to the prisoners. If he catches you, he'll have you arrested as a Confederate sympathizer or worse." "I served the Union during the war," Sarah replied firmly. "I nursed soldiers at Gettysburg and Antietam. My loyalty to this country is beyond question. Your loyalty to the country isn't what Stone will question," Parker said quietly. "It's your loyalty to his interpretation of justice that concerns him." Sarah considered this as she gathered her medical supplies. "Lieutenant, what will happen to these men if they recover?" Parker's silence was answer enough. The Apache prisoners were being kept alive only long enough to provide intelligence about their people's movements and strongholds. Once they had served that purpose, or proven unable to provide useful information, their fate was sealed. "The boy is barely more than a child," Sarah continued. "And the old man is clearly a non-combatant, probably a medicine man or elder. As for Joseph Crow Feather, he's conducted himself with more honor than many soldiers I've known." "Honor doesn't change the fact that he's killed white men," Parker replied, "or that his people continue to raid settlements and attack supply trains." "And white soldiers haven't killed Apache women and children?" Sarah challenged. "War makes murderers of us all, Lieutenant. The question is whether we can remember our humanity in spite of it." Parker had no answer for that, and Sarah continued on her way to the partition where the 3 Apache men waited. What she found there surprised her. Joseph Crow Feather was sitting up, his back against the rough wooden wall, quietly speaking to his companions in their own language. When he saw Sarah approach, he fell silent. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, setting down her medical bag and lantern. "Stronger," Joseph admitted. "Your medicine is powerful." Sarah began examining his wounds, pleased to see that they were healing cleanly. "It's not magic," she said. "Just proper cleaning and antiseptic care. Something your own healers would understand better than many white doctors." Joseph watched her work with careful attention. "You know something of Apache healing?" "I know that all healing traditions share common elements," Sarah replied, applying fresh bandages to a deep cut on his arm. "Clean wounds, proper herbs, and the will to live." "The will to live," Joseph repeated thoughtfully. "That has been complicated lately." Sarah looked up from her work, meeting his gaze directly. "Why?" Joseph was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sadness that transcended language barriers. "My people are dying, Miss Mitchell. Not just from your soldiers' bullets, but from disease, from starvation as we are driven from our traditional lands, from despair as our children forget the old ways. Sometimes I wonder if death in battle might be preferable to watching everything I have known slowly disappear." The honesty of his words caught Sarah off guard. She had expected anger, defiance, perhaps even threats. Instead, she was hearing the pain of a man watching his entire world crumble around him. "Your people are survivors," she said finally. "They've endured in this harsh land for countless generations. That kind of strength doesn't disappear easily." "Perhaps not," Joseph agreed, "but survival and living are not the same thing." As Sarah continued her rounds, checking on Gray Wolf and Standing Horse, she found herself thinking about Joseph's words. The old warrior was indeed recovering well, his fever completely gone and his shoulder wound showing signs of healthy healing. The young man's leg was more problematic. Without proper surgical intervention, he would likely walk with a permanent limp if he walked at all. "Standing Horse's leg needs to be reset," Sarah told Joseph. "The bones have begun healing improperly." Joseph translated this to the boy, whose face paled but who nodded resolutely. He asks if you can do this thing. Sarah hesitated. The procedure would require Dr. Hayes' authorization and assistance, which would expose her unauthorized treatment of the prisoners. But without intervention, the young warrior faced a lifetime of disability. I would need help, she admitted. And it would have to be done properly, with adequate pain medication and surgical instruments. Joseph spoke again with standing horse, then turned back to Sarah. He says he would rather face the pain now than carry the weakness forever. But he understands if you cannot risk helping him. The trust in both their voices was humbling. Here were men who had every reason to distrust her people, yet they were willing to place their lives in her hands based on a few nights of secret medical care. Let me speak with Dr. Hayes, Sarah said finally. There may be a way to help without compromising anyone's position. As she prepared to leave, Joseph caught her attention once more. Miss Mitchell, why do you do this? Your own people would call you a traitor. My people might see you as just another white attempting to win their trust for some hidden purpose. Yet you come here each night, risking punishment to ease our pain. Why? Sarah considered the question, searching for words to explain something she barely understood herself. Because suffering is suffering, regardless of who experiences it. Because I believe healing is sacred, whether the patient is white or Apache, soldier or warrior. And because I've seen too much death and hatred. If I can preserve life instead of destroying it, then perhaps there's still hope for all of us. Joseph studied her face in the lamplight, as if memorizing her features. You are not like other white women I have known. You've known many white women? Sarah asked, surprised. A ghost of a smile crossed Joseph's features. I attended mission school as a boy, before my father decided that the white man's education was another form of imprisonment. I learned your language, your customs, even some of your healing practices. Sister Catherine was a kind woman who tried to teach us that all people were children of the same Great Spirit. The revelation that Joseph had formal education explained his perfect English and his understanding of white customs. It also added another layer of tragedy to his situation. He had tried to bridge two worlds, only to find himself trapped between them. What happened to Sister Catherine? Sarah asked. Joseph's expression darkened. She died when soldiers burned the mission during a retaliatory raid. She was trying to protect Apache children who had taken shelter there. The words hung heavy in the air between them, another reminder of the brutal cycles of violence that had characterized relations between whites and Apaches for decades. Sarah felt the weight of collective guilt, even as she recognized that individuals on both sides had committed atrocities. I'm sorry, she said quietly. There's too much blood on everyone's hands. Yes, Joseph agreed. But perhaps there are also hands meant for healing rather than killing. Your hands, Miss Mitchell, carry the power to create rather than destroy. As Sarah returned to her quarters that night, Joseph's words echoed in her mind. She was beginning to understand that her secret medical visits had become about more than just treating wounds. They were becoming a bridge between two worlds at war, a small act of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. But she also sensed that greater challenges lay ahead. Captain Stone's suspicions were growing, and the military situation in the territory was becoming increasingly volatile. Apache raids were increasing in frequency and boldness, and there were rumors that several bands were preparing to unite under a single war chief for a massive assault on white settlements. In the midst of all this tension, 3 wounded Apache warriors lay in the fort's infirmary, slowly recovering under the secret care of a white nurse who was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about enemies and allies, civilization, and savagery, duty, and compassion. What Sarah Mitchell didn't yet realize was that her acts of mercy were about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not only her own beliefs and loyalties, but the very foundations of the conflict. that had torn the Arizona Territory apart for generations. The wounded brave she was healing with such care was about to offer her something that would test every assumption she held about her place in this harsh and beautiful land. And in the process, both Sarah and Joseph would discover that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in taking a life, but in the willingness to completely change one's own. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Fort Carson that changed everything Sarah thought she understood about her position. Maria Santos arrived with a supply wagon from Tucson, her weathered hands guiding the team of oxen with practiced ease despite her advancing years. Maria had been delivering goods to frontier outposts for over a decade, and her reputation for fairness in dealing with both military personnel and local tribes had earned her a unique position of trust. Sarah first encountered Maria in the fort's quartermaster office, where the older woman was arguing with Sergeant Murphy about the quality of medical supplies in her latest delivery. "These bandages are no better than rags," Maria declared, holding up a roll of coarse cloth. "You expect Dr. Hayes to work miracles with materials fit only for cleaning stables?" Sergeant Murphy, a burly Irishman with little patience for complaints, waved dismissively. "The Army takes what it can get, Signora. If you don't like our business, plenty of other traders would be happy to take your place." "Other traders don't care if soldiers die from infections that proper supplies could prevent," Maria shot back. Her dark eyes, sharp despite her 60-odd years, caught sight of Sarah entering the office. "You must be the nurse I've heard about. The one who actually knows medicine instead of just following orders." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I do my best with what's available." Maria studied her with the same intensity Sarah had observed in Joseph Crowfeather's gaze. "What's available is not always what's needed, Verdad. Sometimes we must find other ways." There was something in the woman's tone that suggested deeper meaning. But before Sarah could respond, Captain Stone entered the office. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, tension crackling through the air like lightning before a desert storm. "Senora Santos," Stone said coldly, "I trust your journey from Tucson was uneventful. As uneventful as any journey can be in a land torn by war," Maria replied, meeting the captain's hostile stare without flinching. "Though I did encounter an Apache hunting party near Copper Ridge. They seemed more interested in finding food for their families than in fighting soldiers." Stone's jaw tightened. "Apache savages don't hunt, they raid. Any encounter with them should have been reported immediately to the nearest cavalry patrol, should it?" Maria's voice carried a note of challenge. "Even when they made no aggressive moves and showed more courtesy than some white men I've dealt with?" The standoff between the elderly Mexican woman and the rigid Army captain was interrupted by Dr. Hayes, who burst into the office with uncharacteristic urgency. "Sarah, thank God you're here," he said breathlessly. "We have an emergency. 3 more Apache prisoners were brought in an hour ago, and one of them is barely alive. I need your assistance immediately." Sarah's heart sank as she followed Dr. Hayes toward the infirmary. 3 more wounded Apache meant more suffering, more men facing the same grim fate as Joseph Gray Wolf and Standing Horse. As they hurried across the parade ground, she noticed Maria Santos following them, her worn leather satchel bouncing against her hip. The new prisoners had been placed in the same segregated section as the others, but their wounds were far more severe. The youngest looked to be about 12 years old, unconscious and burning with fever from infected bullet wounds in his chest and shoulder. Beside him lay a warrior of middle years, his left arm nearly severed at the elbow, blood seeping through hastily applied bandages. The third was an elderly woman, her gray hair matted with blood from a head wound, her breathing shallow and irregular. "The woman isn't even a combatant," Dr. Hayes muttered as he examined the unconscious boy. "But Stone insists she's a valuable intelligence asset. Apparently she's some kind of medicine woman or tribal elder." Sarah felt sick as she took in the scene. The treatment of wounded enemies was brutal enough, but including a child and an elderly woman crossed lines that even war shouldn't violate. "Doctor," she said quietly, "the boy needs surgery immediately, and the woman requires careful monitoring for potential brain injury. As for the warrior, if we don't stop that bleeding and properly treat his arm, he'll be dead within hours." Hayes rubbed his face wearily. "I know what they need, Sarah, but I also know what I can provide given our constraints. Basic field dressing, pain medication if we can spare it, and prayers." "That's not enough," Sarah protested. "These people deserve proper medical care regardless of their status as prisoners." "Deserve?" Captain Stone's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. He had entered the infirmary unnoticed, his cold eyes taking in the scene with evident satisfaction. Enemy combatants deserve nothing but what keeps them alive long enough to provide useful information. Sarah turned to face him, her patience finally reaching its breaking point. "Captain, one of these patients is a child who couldn't possibly pose a military threat. Another is an elderly woman who appears to be a healer, not a warrior. Where's the honor in denying medical care to non-combatants?" Stone stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Miss Mitchell, I've been tolerant of your humanitarian impulses up to this point, but I'm beginning to question whether your sympathies lie with the United States Army or with its enemies." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt the eyes of everyone in the infirmary upon her, measuring her response, judging her loyalty. In that moment, she realized she had reached a crossroads that would define not only her future at Fort Carson, but her understanding of her own moral compass. "My sympathies lie with healing," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I took an oath to preserve life, not to judge who deserves to live or die based on the color of their skin or their tribal affiliation." Stone's face flushed with anger. "That attitude will get you court-martialed for treason, nurse. I suggest you reconsider your priorities before you find yourself sharing a cell with these savages." As Stone stalked from the infirmary, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension, Maria Santos stepped forward. She had been observing the confrontation from near the entrance, and now she approached Sarah with something that might have been approval in her weathered features. "Sometimes the greatest courage is found in the smallest acts of defiance," Maria said quietly. "Your words were brave, Mia, but courage without wisdom often leads to martyrdom." Sarah looked at the older woman with new interest. There was clearly more to Maria Santos than met the eye, and her presence at Fort Carson seemed to be more than coincidental. "What do you suggest?" Sarah asked. Maria glanced around the infirmary, ensuring they weren't overheard, then moved closer to Sarah. "I suggest that some healing must be done in shadows, away from the eyes of those who would prevent it. I have supplies in my wagon that aren't listed on any army inventory. Herbs, medicines, tools that might prove useful to someone with your skills and inclinations." The offer was clearly dangerous, potentially treasonous by Captain Stone's standards. Yet as Sarah looked at the wounded Apache prisoners, including the barely breathing child, she knew she couldn't stand by and watch them die for lack of proper care. "What would you want in return?" Sarah asked. Maria's smile was enigmatic. "Nothing you wouldn't freely give. Just the knowledge that somewhere in this godforsaken territory, mercy still exists." That night, after the fort had settled into its evening routine, Sarah made her way to Maria's camp outside the walls. The older woman had set up a small fire near her supply wagon, and was brewing what smelled like medicinal tea in a battered metal pot. "I was wondering when you would come," Maria said without looking up from her fire. "Though I thought it might be sooner, given the condition of those new prisoners." Sarah sat on a fallen log across from Maria, studying the woman's face in the flickering firelight. "How do you know so much about what happens inside the fort?" "I know because I make it my business to know," Maria replied. Information is as valuable as goods in this territory, sometimes more so. And I know that you've been providing unauthorized medical care to Apache prisoners for over a week now. Sarah's blood ran cold. If Maria knew about her secret treatments, others might know as well. Who else knows? Relax, Mia. Your secret is safe with me. But you should know that your Apache patients speak of you with great respect. Word travels quickly through tribal networks, especially when it concerns acts of unexpected kindness. From white people. The revelation that her actions were known beyond Fort Carson was both frightening and strangely validating. What do you mean, they speak of me? Maria poured tea into 2 metal cups, handing one to Sarah. Joseph Crowfeather is not just any Apache warrior. He is the son of Chief Running Bear, but more importantly, he is known among his people as a bridge builder, one who seeks peaceful solutions even in times of war. His capture has caused great distress among several Apache bands. Sarah sipped the tea, finding it pleasantly bitter with undertones of unfamiliar herbs. I didn't realize he was so important to his people. Few white people realize the complexity of Apache society, Maria said. They see only warriors and savages, not the intricate networks of family, clan, and spiritual relationships that bind tribes together. Joseph is respected not just for his skill in battle, but for his wisdom in counsel and his ability to see beyond the immediate conflicts to longer-term solutions. And yet he's here, wounded and facing execution for being a warrior. Maria nodded sadly. Sometimes even the wisest men are caught in circumstances beyond their control. But perhaps his presence here and your kindness toward him serve a purpose neither of you yet understand. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Finally, Maria rose and moved to her wagon, returning with a leather satchel that clinked softly with the sound of glass bottles and metal instruments. These are supplies that won't appear on any army inventory, she said, placing the satchel at Sarah's feet. Antiseptics, pain medicines, surgical tools that are far better than anything Dr. Hayes has access to. Use them wisely and tell no one where they came from. Sarah opened the satchel, revealing medical supplies of a quality she hadn't seen since leaving Pennsylvania. I can't accept these without knowing your true purpose. Why are you helping me? Maria settled back onto her seat, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. My youngest brother was Apache, she said simply. Half Apache, born to a Mexican mother and an Apache father who was killed in a raid before the boy's first birthday. I raised him as my own son, loved him as my own blood. What happened to him? He died at 14, shot by soldiers while trying to steal food for starving relatives on the reservation. The soldiers said he was a hostile, a threat to white settlers. He was a child trying to keep his family from dying of hunger. The story explained much about Maria's motivations and her apparent knowledge of Apache affairs. I'm sorry for your loss. Sorrow doesn't bring back the dead, Maria replied. But sometimes it can save the living. That boy in the infirmary. He's the same age my brother was when he died. Perhaps through your hands, some balance can be restored. Sarah lifted the satchel, feeling its weight both physically and morally. Accepting these supplies would commit her irrevocably to a path that Captain Stone would consider treasonous. Yet the alternative was watching helplessly as wounded prisoners died from neglect. If I'm caught with these, I'll face court-martial. At minimum. If you don't use them, those people will die, Maria countered. Sometimes the choice is between safety and conscience. Only you can decide which matters more. As Sarah made her way back to Fort Carson, the satchel hidden beneath her shawl, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since arriving in Arizona territory. What had begun as a temporary arrangement while she recovered from the stagecoach robbery had become something far more complex, a moral crucible that was testing everything she believed about duty, loyalty, and the nature of healing itself. The fort was quiet as she slipped back into the infirmary, but she was surprised to find Joseph Crowfeather awake and sitting up, speaking softly in Apache to the elderly woman who had been brought in that day. His voice carried a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his reputation as a fierce warrior. "Miss Mitchell," he said as she approached, "Grandmother Moondove has been asking about you." Sarah looked at the elderly woman, whose head wound appeared less severe than it had initially seemed. Her dark eyes, though clouded with pain, held an alertness that suggested she was more aware of her surroundings than her captors realized. "She speaks English?" Sarah asked. "Some," Joseph replied. "She understands much more than she reveals. Grandmother has lived through many conflicts between our peoples. She has learned that sometimes it is safer to appear less intelligent than one truly is." The wisdom in this approach was evident. Captain Stone and his men would be more likely to dismiss an apparently senile old woman as harmless while underestimating her potential value as a source of information. Sarah knelt beside Moondove, gently examining her head wound by lamplight. The injury was painful but not life-threatening, requiring careful cleaning and monitoring for signs of infection. As she worked, the elderly woman spoke to her in heavily accented English. "You are the healing woman Joseph speaks of," Moondove said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The white woman with medicine hands and a good heart." "I'm just trying to help," Sarah replied, cleaning the wound with supplies from Maria's satchel. "Help is a sacred thing," Moondove continued. "Among my people, healers are honored above warriors, for it takes greater courage to preserve life than to take it." The comment echoed something Joseph had said earlier about Sarah's hands being meant for creation rather than destruction. There seemed to be a cultural appreciation for healing among the Apache that transcended the immediate brutalities of warfare. As Sarah moved to examine the young boy, she was relieved to find his fever had broken somewhat, though his wounds remained serious. The warrior with the injured arm was conscious, but weak from blood loss. Using instruments from Maria's satchel, Sarah was able to properly clean and dress his wounds, likely saving his life. "You risk much for strangers," Joseph observed as Sarah worked. "Your own people see this as betrayal." "My own people are wrong," Sarah replied firmly. "Healing should know no boundaries of race or nationality." Joseph studied her face in the lamplight, and Sarah found herself meeting his gaze directly. There was something in his dark eyes that she couldn't quite identify, a depth of understanding that seemed to see beyond the surface of her words to the motivations beneath. "Among my people," he said quietly, "there's a belief that some souls are called to bridge different worlds, to carry understanding between peoples who have forgotten how to see each other as human. Such souls often face great danger, for they belong fully to neither world." "Is that what you think I am?" Sarah asked. "I think you are a woman who follows her conscience even when it leads to dangerous places," Joseph replied. "It is a rare quality in any person, regardless of the color of their skin." As Sarah prepared to leave, Joseph spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that made her pause. "Miss Mitchell, I must tell you something that may change how you see these acts of kindness. Tomorrow, my father's warriors will attempt to rescue us from this place. Many people on both sides will likely die in the fighting that follows." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A rescue attempt would mean a full-scale battle at Fort Carson, with casualties among both soldiers and Apache warriors. The wounded prisoners she had been treating with such care would be at the center of the violence. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because I requested it," Joseph replied simply. "Before my capture, I left word with my people about a signal that would indicate the best time for such an attempt. That signal was given 3 days ago." Sarah felt a mixture of emotions, betrayal, understanding, and a growing dread about what the next day might bring. "You planned this from the beginning." "I planned for the possibility," Joseph corrected. "Just as your Captain Stone plans for various contingencies in war. The difference is that I hope to minimize bloodshed on both sides." "How can a rescue attempt minimize bloodshed?" Joseph's expression grew grave. "Because I intend to propose an exchange that might prevent the need for battle altogether. But such an exchange would require the cooperation of someone trusted by both sides, someone who has already demonstrated that healing matters more than hatred." Sarah realized with growing alarm where this conversation was leading. "You want me to act as an intermediary. I want to offer you a choice, Miss Mitchell. One that could save many lives but would require you to make sacrifices greater than risking Captain Stone's displeasure." As Joseph outlined his plan, Sarah felt the weight of decision settling upon her shoulders. What he was proposing would require her to leave behind everything she had known, to step across cultural boundaries that few white people had ever crossed, and to trust her life to people her own society considered enemies. Yet as she looked around at the wounded prisoners she had been secretly treating, as she considered the violence that would surely come with dawn, Sarah realized that her path had been leading to this moment from the first night she had chosen. Compassion over protocol. The question was whether she had the courage to see it through to whatever end awaited beyond the walls of Fort Carson. Dawn arrived with ominous silence at Fort Carson. The usual bustle of morning duties seemed muted, as if the entire garrison sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with the weight of Joseph's proposal and the knowledge that Apache warriors were even now positioning themselves for an assault on the fort. She rose before reveille, dressing quickly in her plainest clothes and gathering the medical supplies Maria had provided. Whatever happened in the coming hours, the wounded would need care, and she intended to be prepared regardless of which side claimed victory. The infirmary was quiet when she arrived, though she noticed that additional guards had been posted outside during the night. 2 soldiers flanked the entrance, their rifles held at ready positions that suggested heightened alert status. Inside, Dr. Hayes was already tending to the wounded boy, whose condition had worsened overnight. "His fever's spiking again," Dr. Hayes said without looking up from his patient. "I'm not sure he'll survive another day without proper surgical intervention." Sarah knelt beside the unconscious child, feeling his burning forehead and noting the rapid, shallow breathing that indicated severe infection. Using supplies from Maria's hidden cache, she prepared a more potent antiseptic solution than anything available through Army channels. "Sarah, what is that?" Dr. Hayes asked, noticing the unfamiliar bottle she was using. "A traitor brought some additional medical supplies," Sarah replied, which was technically true. "I thought they might be useful for treating infections." Dr. Hayes didn't press for details, too focused on his patient to question the providence of better medicine. Together, they worked to clean the boy's wounds more thoroughly, applying treatments that immediately began showing positive effects. As they worked, Joseph Crowfeather watched from his position against the wall, his dark eyes following every movement. Sarah was acutely aware of his gaze, wondering if he was evaluating her skills or simply memorizing details that might prove important in the coming confrontation. "The boy's name is Little Fox," Joseph said quietly when Dr. Hayes moved to check on other patients. "He's the son of my cousin, captured while hunting rabbits near the settlement. He has never raised a weapon against any white person." The information made Sarah's heart ache for the unconscious child. Whatever conflicts existed between Apache and cavalry forces, this boy was an innocent caught in circumstances beyond his understanding. "Will he live?" Joseph asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern that reminded Sarah that beneath his reputation as a fierce warrior, he was also a man who cared deeply about his family and people. "If the infection can be controlled, yes," Sarah replied, adjusting the boy's bandages. "But he needs rest and proper nutrition, neither of which are readily available in this situation." Joseph nodded grimly. "Perhaps that will change soon." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Commotion erupted outside the infirmary. Shouted orders, running footsteps, and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied filled the morning air. Captain Stone's voice rose above the chaos, barking commands about defensive positions and ammunition distribution. Dr. Hayes rushed to the window, peering through the dusty glass toward the parade ground. "Dear God," he breathed. "There must be 50 Apache warriors on the ridge overlooking the fort." Sarah's stomach clenched with dread. The rescue attempt Joseph had warned her about was beginning, and she found herself trapped between two forces that saw each other as mortal enemies. She glanced toward Joseph, who remained seated against the wall, but whose entire demeanor had changed. His posture was alert, his eyes focused with the intensity of a man preparing for battle. Captain Stone burst into the infirmary, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and rage. "Hayes, get these prisoners secured immediately. I want them in chains and moved to the stockade." "Sir, 2 of them are barely conscious," Dr. Hayes protested. "Moving them could kill them." "Good," Stone snapped. "It would save us the trouble of executions later." His gaze fell on Joseph, and his expression turned predatory, especially this one. "His father's warriors have made a fatal mistake coming here. When I capture Chief Running Bear, I'll have the leverage I need to end Apache resistance in this territory permanently." Joseph met Stone's glare with calm dignity. "My father is not among the warriors you see, Captain. He is too wise to risk himself in such a direct assault." "Then who leads them?" Stone demanded. "That is not for me to say," Joseph replied evenly. Stone's hand moved to his sidearm, but before he could draw it, Lieutenant Parker appeared in the doorway. "Sir, the Apache force has sent forward a single rider carrying a white flag. He's requesting a parley." Stone's eyes narrowed. "A trick. They want to get close enough to assess our defenses." "Perhaps," Parker agreed. "But refusing to honor a flag of truce could have political consequences if word reaches territorial headquarters." Sarah watched this exchange with growing tension, aware that decisions made in the next few minutes could determine whether the confrontation escalated into a bloodbath or found some peaceful resolution. She caught Joseph's eye and saw her own concerns reflected in his expression. "Captain," Sarah spoke up suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness, "if there's to be a parley, perhaps it would be wise to have a medical representative present. Both sides have wounded who might benefit from negotiated care." Stone turned his cold gaze on her. "Miss Mitchell, your opinion on military matters is neither requested nor welcome." "But she raises a valid point, sir," Lieutenant Parker interjected. "If negotiations include prisoner exchanges or medical arrangements, having our chief medical personnel present could be advantageous." For a moment, Sarah thought Stone might explode with rage. Instead, he seemed to consider the suggestion from a purely tactical perspective. "Very well," he said finally. "Hayes, you'll accompany me to the parley. Miss Mitchell will remain here and ensure our prisoners don't attempt anything foolish during the distraction." As Stone and Dr. Hayes departed with an armed escort, Sarah found herself alone with the wounded Apache prisoners and the terrible knowledge of what was about to unfold. The silence in the infirmary felt oppressive, broken only by the labored breathing of the wounded and the distant sounds of soldiers preparing for possible battle. "Miss Mitchell," Joseph said softly, drawing her attention, "what I am about to tell you must remain between us until the proper moment arrives." Sarah moved closer, sensing the gravity in his tone. "The warrior who carries the white flag is my blood brother, Windrunner. He comes not to negotiate for our release, but to deliver a message specifically for you." Sarah felt her world tilt. "For me? I don't understand." "Word of your kindness has traveled through Apache communities faster than your Captain Stone realizes," Joseph explained. "Your secret treatment of wounded prisoners has been observed and reported by scouts who watch this fort constantly. My people know of your courage in defying your own leaders to provide healing. The revelation that her actions had been monitored without her knowledge was both frightening and oddly validating. What kind of message? Joseph's expression became solemn. An invitation. My father, Chief Running Bear, wishes to offer you a position as healer to our people. You would be provided with protection, resources, and the respect accorded to medicine women among the Apache. Sarah stared at him in stunned silence. The proposition was so far beyond anything she had imagined that she could barely process its implications. You're asking me to abandon my own people and join an Apache tribe? I'm asking you to consider where your healing talents could do the most good, Joseph replied carefully. Here, you treat wounded soldiers who will return to fighting as soon as they recover. You save lives only to see them destroyed in the next battle. Among my people, you would heal those who wish to live in peace, who fight only to protect their families and their way of life. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the infirmary window, they could see Captain Stone returning with his escort, his face dark with barely controlled fury. Dr. Hayes walked beside him, his expression troubled and thoughtful. The negotiations didn't go well, Grey Wolf observed from his position near the wall. Despite his age and injuries, the old warrior had been listening intently to every sound from outside. Joseph nodded grimly. Captain Stone is not a man who understands diplomacy. He sees only strength and weakness, victory and defeat. When Stone and Dr. Hayes entered the infirmary, the captain's rage was immediately evident. Savages, he spat, his hands clenched into fists. They had the audacity to demand the immediate release of all Apache prisoners in exchange for a promise not to attack civilian settlements. What was your response? Sarah asked, though she could guess from Stone's demeanor. I told them they could watch their precious war chief's son hang from the fort's flagpole before I'd negotiate with murderers and thieves. Dr. Hayes caught Sarah's eye, shaking his head slightly in a gesture that suggested he disagreed with Stone's approach but was powerless to influence it. Sir, Lieutenant Parker said carefully, the Apache representative mentioned something else. He specifically requested to speak with our medical personnel about arranging care for wounded on both sides. Apparently, they have injured warriors who could benefit from treatment. Stone's eyes narrowed dangerously. Did he now? And I suppose you think we should send our medical staff into an enemy camp to provide aid and comfort to the very savages who've been killing our soldiers. Not necessarily into their camp, Parker replied. But perhaps a neutral meeting ground could be established. A temporary truce for medical purposes only. Absolutely not, Stone declared. Any Apache who wants medical care can surrender unconditionally and face the consequences of their actions. The captain's intransigence was clearly pushing the situation toward violent confrontation. Sarah realized that time was running out for any peaceful resolution, and that Joseph's rescue mission would likely proceed as planned. It was then that Maria Santos appeared in the infirmary doorway, her weathered face grave with concern. Captain Stone, I've just returned from Tucson with disturbing news. A large Apache war party has been gathering near the San Pedro River, led by warriors from 3 different bands. Stone whirled to face her. How large? My contacts estimate over 200 fighters, Maria replied, armed with repeating rifles obtained through trade with Mexican gunrunners. They're planning something significant, Captain and Fort. Carson appears to be the target. The news sent shockwaves through everyone present. 200 Apache warriors represented a force large enough to overwhelm the fort's modest garrison, especially if they were equipped with modern weapons. When? Stone demanded. Soon, Maria said. Perhaps within days. My sources suggest they're waiting for some kind of signal. Sarah's eyes met Joseph's across the room, and she saw the knowledge there that she now shared. The signal had already been given, and the massive war party Maria described wasn't gathering for a future attack. They were already in position. waiting for the rescue attempt to begin. "We need reinforcements immediately," Stone said, turning to Lieutenant Parker. "Send riders to Fort Apache and Fort Huachuca. Tell them we face imminent attack by superior forces." "Sir, the nearest reinforcements are 3 days away," Parker replied. "If this intelligence is accurate, they won't arrive in time to assist." U.S. Stone's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the captain appeared genuinely afraid. The prospect of facing overwhelming odds seemed to strip away some of his arrogant confidence. "Then we'll make our stand here," he said grimly. "Move all non-essential personnel to the interior buildings. Double the ammunition supplies at each defensive position. And get those Apache prisoners secured in the stockade immediately." "Captain," Dr. Hayes interjected, "moving the severely wounded prisoners could kill them. Surely that serves no tactical purpose." "Dead prisoners can't be rescued," Stone replied coldly. "Move them," as soldiers entered to transfer the wounded. Apache to the fort's small jail, Sarah felt the walls of her previous life closing in around her. Everything she had worked to build at Fort Carson, the trust she had earned from Dr. Hayes, the small measure of security she had found in her role as the fort's nurse, was about to be swept away by forces beyond her control. Joseph was lifted, roughly by 2 soldiers despite his protests about his injuries. As they carried him toward the door, he managed to catch Sarah's eye once more. "The offer stands," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "But time grows short for all of us." As the Apache prisoners were removed from the infirmary, Sarah found herself standing in the sudden emptiness, surrounded by the blood-stained bedding and medical debris that marked where wounded men had fought. For their lives, Dr. Hayes moved to her side, his expression troubled. "Sarah, there's something you should know about the Apache emissary's message," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "He specifically mentioned you by name." Sarah's heart skipped. "What did he say?" "He said that the woman called Healing Hands would be welcome among his people, and that her skills would be honored and protected." Captain Stone dismissed it as savage propaganda, but I think there was more to it than that. The confirmation that the Apache knew her by name, had given her a title of respect in their own language, made Joseph's offer feel suddenly more real and more terrifying. "Doctor, what do you think will happen here?" Dr. Hayes removed his spectacles, cleaning them with shaking hands. "Honestly, I think we're about to face a siege that Fort Carson isn't equipped to survive. Our walls are wood and adobe, suitable for deterring small raiding parties, but not a concentrated assault by hundreds of warriors." He replaced his spectacles, meeting her gaze directly. "Sarah, if what Maria reports is true, and if the Apache are as well armed as she suggests, this fort will fall. When it does, anyone associated with the medical treatment of Apache prisoners will face particular danger from our own survivors, who will see such care as collaboration with the enemy." The stark assessment of their situation sent ice through Sarah's veins. She was trapped between opposing forces that would both see her as a traitor, the Apache for being part of the Army medical staff, her own people for showing compassion to enemy wounded. "There may be alternatives," Dr. Hayes continued carefully. "The Apache emissary suggested that medical personnel willing to provide neutral care might be granted safe passage. It's unprecedented, but these are unprecedented times." Sarah realized that Dr. Hayes was essentially encouraging her to consider Joseph's offer, though he couldn't say so directly. The doctor who had become her mentor and protector was releasing her from any obligation to stay and face destruction. Alongside the fort, "Doctor, what about you? Would you consider such an arrangement?" Hayes smiled sadly. "I'm an old man, Sarah, and I took an oath to serve with the United States Army. My place is here, whatever comes. But you're young, with skills that could benefit people regardless of their tribal affiliation. Perhaps it's time to consider where you can do the most good." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of rifle fire in the distance, sporadic shots that suggested skirmishing rather than full battle. Captain Stone's voice could be heard shouting orders across the parade ground, preparing defensive positions for the assault everyone now knew was coming. Maria Santos appeared in the infirmary doorway, her expression urgent. "They're beginning," she said simply. "The Apache have started probing the fort's defenses. It won't be long before the real attack begins." Sarah looked around the infirmary, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become her world over the past months. The medical instruments gleaming on their metal trays, the shelves lined with bottles and bandages, the cots where she had fought death to save men who would return to fighting as soon as they healed. Dr. Hayes was right. This cycle of violence would continue endlessly unless someone chose to break free from it. "Maria," Sarah said suddenly, "you know more about what's happening here than you've revealed. What aren't you telling us?" The older woman glanced around the infirmary, ensuring they were alone, then moved closer to Sarah. "I know that this attack isn't random revenge for the capture of Joseph Crowfeather. It's part of something larger, a final attempt by several Apache bands to drive white forces from their traditional lands before winter sets in." She paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. "I also know that certain Apache leaders have been seeking ways to avoid the total war that Captain Stone seems determined to provoke. They recognize that such a conflict would devastate both sides." "You're saying there's still hope for peace?" "I'm saying there's hope for people who choose peace over victory," Maria replied. "But such choices require great courage and great sacrifice from individuals willing to step outside the boundaries their societies have drawn." The implication was clear. Sarah was being presented with an opportunity to become part of a solution, rather than remaining trapped in an endless cycle of violence and retaliation. But accepting such a role would mean abandoning everything familiar and safe, trusting her future to people she barely understood. The rifle fire outside was growing more intense, and Sarah could hear Captain Stone shouting orders for his men to hold their positions. Whatever decision she made would have to come quickly, before events spiraled beyond anyone's control. "If I were to consider such a path," Sarah said carefully, "what exactly would be expected of me?" Maria and Dr. Hayes exchanged glances, and Sarah realized they had discussed this possibility before involving her in the conversation. "The Apache respect healers above almost all others," Maria explained. "A medicine woman holds a position of honor and influence that transcends tribal politics. She serves all people, provides counsel to leaders, and is protected by sacred traditions even in times of war." "But I'm not Apache," Sarah protested. "How could I possibly fulfill such a role?" "By learning," Dr. Hayes said simply. "Just as you've learned Army medical procedures, you could learn Apache healing traditions. Your existing skills would be valued, and your willingness to serve their people would earn their respect." The sound of gunfire was growing closer, and Sarah realized that the Apache assault on the fort was beginning in earnest. Through the window, she could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding ridges as warriors began their coordinated attack. "The decision must be made now," Maria said urgently. "In a few minutes, this infirmary will be overrun with casualties from both sides, and any chance for peaceful resolution will be lost in the chaos of battle." Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything in her previous life had led to this crossroads, where she must choose between the familiar safety of her own culture and the terrifying unknown of crossing into another world entirely. As she struggled with the decision, little Fox stirred on his makeshift bed, his fever-bright eyes opening to focus on Sarah's face. The boy said something in Apache, his voice weak but urgent. Joseph translated softly. "He says the healing woman has hands touched by the spirits, and that his dreams showed him she would choose the path of peace over the path of war." Whether the child's words were prophecy or merely the delirious ramblings of a fever-sick boy, they seemed to crystallize something in Sarah's mind. She looked around the infirmary once more, at Dr. Hayes, who was watching her with paternal concern, at Maria, whose dark eyes held encouragement and understanding, at the wounded Apache prisoners who represented a people she had never tried to understand until now. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision than a recognition of something that had been building inside her for weeks. Something that had started with simple compassion for wounded enemies and had grown into a deeper understanding of her own purpose in a world torn by hatred and violence. "Tell me exactly what I would need to do," Sarah said to Maria, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting outside. Maria's relief was evident as she quickly outlined the plan. "There's a hidden passage beneath the fort's east wall, used for supply runs during siege conditions. It emerges near the creek where Apache scouts are positioned. You would be escorted to their lines under a flag of medical neutrality, and then you would begin a new life, learning Apache ways while providing healing to their people. It won't be easy, and there will be those on both sides who question your motives. But you would have the protection of some of the most honorable warriors in the territory." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Sarah, you've been like a daughter to me since you arrived at Fort Carson. I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my blessing. You've already done more good in this place than most people accomplish in a lifetime." The explosion of a cannon from the fort's east wall shook dust from the infirmary rafters, reminding everyone that time was running out. Sarah could hear Captain Stone's voice screaming orders as Apache warriors began their assault in earnest. "If I go," Sarah said, looking directly at Joseph, "what guarantee do I have that I'll be safe among your people?" Joseph met her gaze with absolute sincerity. "You have my word, and the word of my father's clan, that you will be protected as a sacred person, a healer whose work serves all life. No Apache warrior would dare harm one who carries the blessing of the medicine people." He paused, then added, "But more than that, you have my personal promise that I will guard your safety with my own life for as long as breath remains in my body." The intensity of his pledge sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with fear. There was something in Joseph's voice, in the way he looked at her, that suggested his feelings toward her had grown beyond simple gratitude for medical care. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you make such a commitment to someone you barely know?" Joseph's answer came without hesitation. "Because in 7 years of warfare, watching friends and family die, losing hope that peace could ever exist between our peoples, you are the first white person to show me that healing can triumph over hatred. You risked everything to ease our suffering when you owed us nothing. Such courage deserves to be protected and honored." The building shook again as another cannon round exploded, this one much closer to the infirmary. Sarah could hear the sound of splintering wood and men screaming, the terrible symphony of battle that she had hoped never to experience again. "Sarah," Dr. Hayes said urgently, "you must decide now. Maria can guide you to the passage, but once the fighting intensifies, it will be too dangerous." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the decision that would define the rest of her life. When she opened them, her resolve was clear. "Show me the way." As Maria led her toward the back of the infirmary, where a hidden trapdoor provided access to the underground passage, Sarah gathered the most essential medical supplies she could carry. Dr. Hayes pressed a small leather journal into her hands. "My notes on treating various conditions," he explained. "It might prove useful in your new life." At the trapdoor, Sarah paused for one final look at Joseph Crowfeather. Despite his injuries and the chaos surrounding them, he managed a smile that transformed his entire face. "I will see you again soon," he promised, "in a place where healing matters more than fighting." As Sarah descended into the dark tunnel that would carry her away from Fort Carson and everything familiar, she realized she was not just escaping from a military disaster, but stepping across a threshold into a completely different understanding of her own purpose and identity. Behind her, The sounds of battle grew louder as Apache warriors stormed the fort's defenses. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the promise of a life dedicated to healing in ways she had never imagined possible. The woman who emerged from that tunnel would no longer be simply Sarah Mitchell, Army nurse. She would become something new. A bridge between worlds, carrying skills and knowledge that could serve a people who had learned to see healing as sacred and healers as worthy of the highest honor. What she didn't yet know was how profoundly this choice would change not only her own destiny, but the course of relations between Apache and white settlements throughout Arizona territory, proving that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with compassion and the courage to cross lines that others refuse even to approach. The tunnel beneath Fort Carson was older than Sarah had expected, carved from solid rock and reinforced with timber that showed signs of decades of use. Maria's lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls as they made their way through the narrow passage, the sound of battle growing muffled but still audible overhead. This was built during the first Apache Wars, Maria explained, her voice echoing softly in the confined space. The original commander knew he might need escape routes if the fort was overrun. Sarah clutched her medical bag tightly, trying to ignore the weight of what she was leaving behind. Every step took her further from the familiar world of Army protocol and closer to an unknown future among people she had been taught to fear. The tunnel emerged in a grove of cottonwood trees beside Willow Creek, about half a mile from the fort's walls. As they climbed out of the hidden entrance, Sarah could see the glow of fires in the distance and hear the crack of rifle shots echoing across the desert landscape. "There," Maria whispered, pointing to a cluster of rocks near the creek bank. "Windrunner waits with 2 other warriors. They've been watching for you." 3 figures materialized from the shadows, moving with the fluid silence that marked experienced Apache scouts. The leader, a tall man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on Sarah with curiosity rather than hostility, and when he spoke, his English was clear and precise. "You are the healing woman called Sarah Mitchell," he said. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "I am Windrunner, blood brother to Joseph Crowfeather. My chief has sent me to escort you to our camp, where your skills are greatly needed." He gestured toward the distant sounds of battle. "Many warriors have been wounded in tonight's fighting. Will you come?" The moment of final commitment had arrived. Sarah looked back toward Fort Carson, where flames were beginning to rise above the wooden palisade walls. Somewhere in that chaos, Dr. Hayes was likely treating wounded soldiers. Captain Stone was fighting for his life, and the Apache prisoners she had secretly cared for were caught in the middle of a battle they couldn't escape. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "I'll come." Windrunner's companions emerged fully from the shadows, revealing themselves to be a woman of perhaps 40 years and a young man barely out of his teens. Both carried medical pouches and supplies, marking them as healers in their own right. "This is Bright Moon, our medicine woman," Windrunner said, indicating the older woman. "And this is her apprentice, Swift Arrow. They will help you understand our ways of healing." Bright Moon approached Sarah without fear, studying her face in the moonlight. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Windrunner says you have medicine hands, that you healed our wounded with great skill. But healing among my people requires more than knowledge of white man's medicine. Are you prepared to learn the sacred ways?" Sarah met the medicine woman's penetrating gaze. "I'm prepared to learn whatever I need to serve your people properly." Something in Sarah's response seemed to satisfy Bright Moon, who nodded approvingly. "Good. Humility is the first requirement for a true healer. Pride kills more patience than ignorance." As they prepared to leave the creek bank, Sarah heard the distant sound of horses approaching. Windrunner and his companions immediately took defensive positions, their hands moving to weapons with practiced ease. "Apache riders," Swift Arrow whispered after listening intently. coming fast from the direction of the fort. A group of mounted warriors emerged from the darkness, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim. The leader, a powerfully built man with graying hair and ceremonial scars marking his cheeks, dismounted and approached Windrunner. The two men spoke rapidly in Apache, their voices urgent. Sarah caught Joseph's name several times, along with words that sounded like expressions of concern or alarm. "What's happening?" Sarah asked when the conversation concluded. Windrunner's expression was troubled as he turned to face her. Joseph Crowfeather was badly injured during the rescue attempt. A cavalry saber cut deep across his back as he helped other prisoners escape. He needs immediate medical attention. Sarah's heart lurched with fear and professional concern. "Where is he now?" "Being carried to our main camp in the mountains." A gray-haired warrior replied in heavily accented English. "But the journey is long, and he loses much blood. Without proper treatment soon, he may not survive." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the man who had offered her sanctuary among his people now needed her healing skills to live. "How far to your camp?" 2 hours hard riding, Windrunner replied. "But the path is treacherous in darkness and dangerous if cavalry patrols pursue us." Sarah made her decision without hesitation. "Then we need to leave immediately." "Do you have horses?" Within minutes, Sarah found herself mounted on a sturdy Apache pony, following Windrunner and his companions up a narrow trail that wound into the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The pace was punishing, but she managed to keep up despite her limited experience with horseback riding over rough terrain. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the sounds of battle from Fort Carson faded behind them, replaced by the night sounds of the high desert. Owls called from hidden perches, coyotes yipped in the distance, and the wind whispered through pine branches with an almost musical quality. "Your fort burns," Bright Moon said, riding alongside Sarah as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Many soldiers will die tonight." Sarah felt a pang of grief for Dr. Hayes and the other people she had worked with, but also a strange sense of inevitability. "War leaves no one untouched." "True," Bright Moon agreed. "But this war may finally be ending. The great chiefs have decided that fighting the White Army costs too much Apache blood. Better to find new ways to preserve our people." The statement surprised Sarah. "You're seeking peace?" "We seek survival," Bright Moon corrected. "Peace is only valuable if it allows our children to grow up learning Apache ways. Your people offer peace that means living like whites on reservations, forgetting our language, our ceremonies, our connection to the land. That is not peace, that is slow death." Sarah was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation she had entered. The Apache weren't simply fighting for territory or revenge. They were struggling to preserve an entire way of life that they saw as threatened with extinction. "Is that why Joseph offered me a place among your people?" Sarah asked. "To help find alternatives to reservation life?" Bright Moon studied her carefully before answering. "Joseph Crowfeather sees further than most warriors. He understands that our people need allies who can bridge the gap between Apache and white worlds. A healer who knows both medicines, both languages, both ways of thinking about life and death." They rode in silence for several minutes, the trail becoming increasingly narrow as they climbed deeper into the mountains. Finally, Windrunner called a halt near a natural spring where the horses could drink and rest briefly. "The main camp is just ahead," he announced. "But you should know what you will find there. Joseph's injuries are severe, and our own healers have done what they can. If he dies despite your efforts, some warriors may blame you for arriving too late." Sarah accepted a drink of water from Swift Arrow, considering Windrunner's warning. "And if I save his life? Then you will have proven your value to our people beyond question," Bright Moon replied. "Joseph is beloved by many clans. His survival would be seen as a sign that the spirits approve of cooperation with whites who showed genuine respect for Apache ways. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She was about to attempt the most important medical procedure of her career, in primitive conditions, using unfamiliar medicines, while being watched by people who might judge her entire race based on her success or failure. "I'll need to know exactly what supplies you have available," she told Bright Moon. "Both traditional Apache medicines and any materials obtained from trading posts." For the next several minutes, as their horses rested, Bright Moon outlined the medical resources available at the camp. Sarah was surprised to learn that Apache healers possessed extensive knowledge of surgical procedures, pain management, and infection control, though their methods differed significantly from white medical practices. "We have willow bark for pain, which your people call aspirin," Bright Moon explained. "Desert sage for cleaning wounds, prickly pear juice to prevent infection, and mescal root for deep cuts that need stitching." Sarah realized that Apache medicine might be more sophisticated than she had assumed. "What about surgical instruments?" "We have metal knives obtained through trade, needles made from cactus thorns and porcupine quills, and thread spun from plant fibers and animal sinew." Bright Moon paused. "But Joseph's injury may require the white medicine you carry. Our healers believe some wounds respond better to your treatments." As they remounted and continued toward the main camp, Sarah mentally prepared for the challenge ahead. She would need to combine her own medical training with Apache healing knowledge, working under conditions unlike anything she had experienced at Fort Carson. The Apache camp was larger than Sarah had expected, with more than 100 lodges scattered through a hidden valley surrounded by towering rock formations. Fires burned throughout the settlement, and she could see people moving between the structures with the quiet efficiency of a community accustomed to mobility and danger. Windrunner led them to a large lodge near the center of the camp, where several warriors stood guard outside. Their faces were grim, and Sarah could see the concern in their eyes as they recognized her as the white healer they had been expecting. Inside the lodge, Sarah found Joseph lying on a bed of buffalo robes, his back wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. His breathing was shallow and labored, his face pale despite his dark complexion. An elderly man with elaborate ceremonial tattoos knelt beside him, chanting softly in Apache while burning some kind of aromatic herb. "This is Painted Wolf, our most senior medicine man," Bright Moon whispered. "He has been keeping Joseph's spirit anchored to this world while we waited for your arrival." Sarah approached the bed cautiously, not wanting to disrespect the ongoing ceremony, but needing to assess Joseph's condition. When Painted Wolf looked up at her, his ancient eyes held wisdom and a surprising lack of hostility toward a white stranger. "You are the healing woman Joseph spoke of," he said in carefully pronounced English. "The one who showed mercy when mercy was dangerous." "I'm here to help in whatever way I can," Sarah replied, setting down her medical bag. Painted Wolf nodded approvingly. "Good. Joseph has lost much blood, and the wound is deep. Our ceremonies can strengthen his spirit, but his body needs the white medicine you possess." As Sarah began examining Joseph's injuries, she was impressed by the quality of care he had already received. The wound had been thoroughly cleaned, and Apache healers had used sophisticated techniques to control bleeding and prevent infection. "This is excellent work," she told Bright Moon, who was assisting her. "Your healers understand anatomy better than many army surgeons I've known." The saber cut was indeed severe, running diagonally across Joseph's back from shoulder blade to spine. It had missed vital organs but cut deep enough to damage muscles and possibly nick bone. The immediate danger was blood loss and infection, both of which could be fatal without proper treatment. Working by firelight and oil lamps, Sarah began the delicate process of cleaning and suturing the wound. She used her own sterile instruments combined with Apache antiseptic preparations, finding that the traditional medicines were remarkably effective. As she worked, other members of the tribe gathered outside the lodge, their voices rising and falling in what sounded like prayers or ceremonial chants. Sarah realized that Joseph's survival had significance beyond his personal value. He represented hope for peaceful coexistence between Apache and white communities. "How long has he been unconscious?" Sarah asked Bright Moon as she carefully stitched the deepest portions of the wound. "Since shortly after arriving here," Bright Moon replied. "He spoke your name several times before the fever dreams began, asking if you had reached safety." The information touched Sarah more deeply than she expected. Even while gravely injured, Joseph had been concerned for her welfare rather than his own. "His pulse is strengthening," she observed with relief. "The bleeding has stopped, and there are no signs of internal damage to organs." Painted Wolf, who had been maintaining his ceremonial vigil throughout Sarah's medical work, suddenly smiled. "The spirits approve of your healing methods. They tell me Joseph's life path continues beyond this injury." Whether it was spiritual intervention or simply good medicine, Joseph's condition began improving noticeably over the next hour. His breathing deepened, his color improved, and his fever broke as Sarah applied cooling compresses made from Apache medicinal herbs. As dawn light began filtering through the lodge entrance, Joseph's eyes opened. They were clouded with pain and medication, but clearly focused on Sarah's face hovering above him. "You came," he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promised I would," Sarah replied, checking his pulse and temperature. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by cavalry horses," Joseph admitted, attempting a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to your healing hands." The reunion was interrupted by Windrunner entering the lodge with urgent news. "Soldiers are approaching the valley entrance," he announced. "A cavalry patrol, probably searching for survivors from the fort attack." Sarah felt her stomach clench with dread. If army forces had tracked them to the Apache camp, her presence there would be seen as definitive proof of treason. Captain Stone, if he had survived the battle, would show no mercy to a military nurse found among enemy forces. "How many soldiers?" Painted Wolf asked calmly. "Perhaps 20 riders," Windrunner replied. "Led by an officer I don't recognize. They're moving cautiously, as if unsure of our exact location." Joseph struggled to sit up despite his injuries. "We must not let them find this camp. Too many families have taken shelter here." "You're in no condition to fight," Sarah protested, gently pressing him back onto the buffalo robes. "I'm in no condition to run either," Joseph replied grimly. "If soldiers discover us here, many people will die." Bright Moon spoke up from her position near the lodge entrance. "There may be another way. If the white healing woman were to meet with the soldiers under a flag of truce, she might convince them that no hostile forces are present in this area." The suggestion sent chills through Sarah. Approaching an army patrol while dressed in Apache clothing, carrying native medicines, and obviously having spent time in an enemy camp would be tantamount to suicide. "They'll arrest me as a deserter or collaborator," she said. "Not if you're obviously providing medical care to wounded non-combatants," Painted Wolf said thoughtfully. "Apache law protects healers even during warfare. Perhaps white law has similar provisions." Joseph's eyes met Sarah's, and she could see the conflict there between his desire to protect her and his recognition that she might be their only hope of avoiding a massacre. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I won't ask you to take such a risk. You've already sacrificed enough to be here." But Sarah was already considering the possibilities. If she could convince the patrol that she was providing humanitarian medical aid rather than military intelligence, they might accept her explanation and withdraw without discovering the main camp. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Windrunner outlined a plan that was both simple and terrifying. Sarah would approach the soldiers alone, carrying obvious medical supplies and claiming to be treating injured civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of the previous night's battle. The Apache would position themselves to intervene if the soldiers proved hostile, but their preferred outcome was peaceful withdrawal. "The risk is enormous," Bright Moon warned. "White soldiers are not known for their mercy toward anyone found among Apache forces. But the alternative is warfare that could destroy this entire community," Sarah replied. "I didn't come here to watch people die when I might prevent it." As the Apache camp quickly prepared for the possibility of attack or flight, Sarah gathered supplies for her dangerous diplomatic mission. She changed back into her white clothing to appear less threatening to the soldiers, but carried Apache medicines to demonstrate her humanitarian purpose. Joseph watched these preparations with obvious distress. "If something happens to you because of my people's needs, I will never forgive myself." "Nothing will happen that I don't choose to accept," Sarah assured him. "And if it does, at least it will be in service of healing rather than destruction." As she prepared to leave the lodge and face whatever consequences awaited, Sarah realized that her transformation was now complete. She was no longer simply a white woman helping wounded enemies. She had become a bridge between two worlds, risking everything to prevent further bloodshed. The woman who walked out of that Apache lodge to meet an approaching cavalry patrol was someone she wouldn't have recognized just weeks earlier. Sarah Mitchell, Army nurse, had disappeared somewhere in the tunnels beneath Fort Carson. The person who emerged was something new, a healer without boundaries of race or nationality, committed to preserving life regardless of the personal cost. What she didn't yet know was that her willingness to place herself in mortal danger to protect Apache families would earn her a level of respect and trust among Joseph's people that few whites had ever achieved. More importantly, it would prove to Joseph Crow Feather himself that his feelings for her were justified, and that the remarkable woman who had risked everything to heal his people was worthy of the most sacred offer his culture could bestow. The approaching soldiers represented not just immediate danger, but the final test that would determine whether Sarah could truly bridge the gap between Apache and white worlds, or whether the hatred and suspicion that had fueled decades of warfare would ultimately consume even the most courageous attempts at peace. As she walked toward the valley entrance where destiny waited in the form of armed men on horseback, Sarah carried with her the hopes of an entire community and the knowledge that some choices, once made, change not only individual lives but the course of history itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Sarah walked steadily toward the dust cloud that marked the approaching cavalry patrol. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps remained measured and deliberate. In her hands, she carried a white cloth tied to a mesquite branch and a medical bag that contained both Army supplies and Apache remedies. Lieutenant Parker's voice reached her before she could clearly see his face, calling out commands for his men to halt and maintain formation. As the dust settled, Sarah recognized several familiar faces among the 20 soldiers, including Sergeant Murphy and young Private Henderson, whom she had treated for pneumonia just 2 weeks earlier. "Miss Mitchell?" Lieutenant Parker's voice cracked with disbelief as he urged his horse forward. "Dear God, we thought you were dead. Captain Stone said you disappeared during the attack on the fort." Sarah stopped about 30 yards from the patrol, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to retreat if necessary. "I'm alive, Lieutenant, and providing medical assistance to wounded civilians in the area." Parker dismounted and approached on foot, his hand resting on his sidearm but not drawing it. His young face was haggard with exhaustion and grief, suggesting the battle at Fort Carson had taken a terrible toll. "Sarah, where have you been?" "We've been searching for survivors since dawn. The fort was overrun, and we lost nearly half our garrison." His voice broke slightly. "Dr. Hayes is dead. Captain Stone is missing and presumed killed." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Dr. Hayes, who had become like a father to her, who had protected and mentored her, was gone forever. She felt tears spring to her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "How?" she asked quietly. "The infirmary took a direct hit from Apache fire arrows, Parker replied, his own grief evident. The doctor was trying to evacuate wounded soldiers when the roof collapsed. He died doing his duty. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer for the man who had shown her what it meant to heal with both skill and compassion. When she opened them, her resolve was stronger than ever. "Lieutenant, I'm providing medical care to people injured in last night's fighting," she said clearly. "Both white settlers and Apache non-combatants. There are children and elderly people who need treatment regardless of their tribal affiliation." Parker's expression grew troubled. "Sarah, you can't be treating enemy forces. That would constitute giving aid and comfort to hostiles, which is treason under military law." "I'm treating human beings who are suffering," Sarah replied firmly. "The same oath I took to serve as an army nurse requires me to preserve life whenever possible." Sergeant Murphy had ridden forward to join the conversation, his weathered Irish face showing a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Begging the lieutenant's pardon, but Miss Mitchell's been missing all night. How do we know she wasn't captured and forced to cooperate with Apache forces?" The suggestion that she might be acting under duress provided Sarah with an unexpected opportunity. "Sergeant, do I appear to be under any physical restraint or coercion?" Parker studied her appearance carefully. She was dusty and tired, but clearly unharmed and speaking freely. More importantly, she was approaching them voluntarily rather than trying to hide or escape. "No," he admitted. "You appear to be acting of your own free will." "Because I am," Sarah said. "When the fort was attacked, I took shelter in the desert with medical supplies. I've encountered wounded people from both sides of this conflict, and I've treated them according to my medical training and ethical obligations." It was technically true, though it omitted crucial details about her deliberate choice to join the Apache community. Sarah hoped that Parker's respect for her and his inexperience with frontier politics might lead him to accept her explanation. "Where exactly are these wounded people?" Murphy asked suspiciously. Sarah gestured toward a cluster of rocks about half a mile away, where Windrunner and his companions were positioned to observe the meeting. "There's a natural shelter where several families took refuge during the fighting. I've been providing what care I can with limited supplies." Parker considered this for several moments, his inner conflict evident. As a West Point graduate with idealistic notions about military honor, he was inclined to respect Sarah's humanitarian motives. As a cavalry officer responsible for pursuing hostile Apache forces, he was obligated to investigate any potential enemy presence in the area. "I'll need to verify your story," he said finally. "We'll escort you back to these injured civilians and ensure they receive proper care." Sarah's heart sank. If the patrol insisted on investigating her claimed treatment site, they would inevitably discover the Apache camp hidden in the valley beyond. The deception would be exposed, and the confrontation she was trying to prevent would become inevitable. "Lieutenant, some of these people are Apache," she said carefully. "They may flee if they see armed soldiers approaching. That could complicate treatment of the seriously wounded." "Apache?" Murphy's hand moved closer to his weapon. "You're treating hostile Indians?" "I'm treating injured human beings," Sarah replied, meeting his hostile gaze directly. "Some of whom are Apache women and children who were caught in the crossfire of last night's battle." Parker wrestled visibly with the implications. "Sarah, I understand your medical ethics, but harboring enemy forces, even wounded ones, puts you in an extremely dangerous legal position." "What would you have me do?" Sarah challenged. "Let children die because of their tribal affiliation? Ignore elderly people suffering from injuries simply because they're Apache?" The moral question hung in the desert air like a challenge. Several of the younger soldiers looked uncomfortable, clearly torn between their military training and their respect for Sarah's reputation as a healer. Private Henderson finally spoke up. "Miss Mitchell saved my life when I had the lung fever," he said quietly. "If she says these people need medical help, I believe her." Other soldiers nodded agreement, remembering their own experiences with Sarah's compassionate care. Their support gave her hope that a peaceful resolution might still be possible. "Lieutenant," Sarah said, pressing what advantage she had, "I propose a compromise. Allow me to return to my patients and complete their treatment. In exchange, I'll provide you with information about Apache movements in this area and coordinate the safe evacuation of any white civilians who may be hiding in the desert." It was a calculated risk, offering intelligence cooperation while maintaining her humanitarian mission. Parker seemed to consider the proposal seriously. "What kind of information about Apache movements?" he asked. Sarah chose her words carefully. "The war party that attacked Fort Carson has dispersed into smaller groups heading toward Mexico. They're not planning additional attacks on military installations or settlements. Their goal was to rescue captured warriors, not to continue warfare." This was largely true based on what she had learned from Windrunner and the other Apache. Warriors. The massive assault on Fort Carson had been a desperate attempt to free prisoners before they could be executed, not part of a broader campaign against white settlements. "How can you be certain of this?" Murphy demanded skeptically. "Because I've spoken with some of the wounded fighters," Sarah replied. "They made it clear that their people want to avoid further bloodshed if possible." Parker studied her face intently, trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or had been deceived by Apache captors. After a long moment, he seemed to reach a decision. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to accept your word about the intelligence situation, based on your record of loyal service and Dr. Hayes' recommendation before his death." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "However, I cannot ignore the presence of Apache forces in this area, even wounded ones." Sarah's heart sank, but Parker continued. "Therefore, I'm prepared to offer the following arrangement. You may complete your medical treatment of wounded non-combatants, both white and Apache, under flag of truce. My patrol will provide security to ensure no interference from hostile forces. When your medical work is finished, you'll return with us to territorial headquarters for debriefing." The offer was more generous than Sarah had dared hope, but it still presented enormous problems. Accepting Parker's protection would expose the Apache camp to military observation, while refusing might lead to immediate arrest or combat. "Lieutenant, may I have a few minutes to consider your proposal and consult with my patients about their comfort with military presence during treatment?" Parker nodded. "Take the time you need, but understand that we cannot remain in this area indefinitely. Other Apache forces may be operating nearby." As Sarah walked back toward the rocky outcropping where Windrunner waited, her mind raced with possibilities. She needed to communicate Parker's offer to the Apache leadership and determine whether any form of truce arrangement might be acceptable. Windrunner emerged from concealment as she approached, his expression tense. "What did the soldier chief say?" "He's offering medical truce," Sarah explained quickly. "His patrol would provide security while I treat wounded people, then escort me back to Army headquarters for questioning." "And if we refuse?" "He'll probably insist on investigating the area anyway, which could lead to the discovery of your main camp." Windrunner considered this grimly. "I must speak with the elders immediately. This decision affects more than just the wounded." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah waited anxiously while Apache messengers carried word back to the hidden camp and returned with responses from the tribal leadership. She could see Parker growing impatient with the delay, consulting his pocket watch and conferring with Sergeant Murphy about their patrol schedule. Finally, Windrunner returned with an elderly Apache man Sarah hadn't met before. The newcomers, elaborate ceremonial dress and authoritative bearing, marked him as someone of high rank within the tribal hierarchy. "This is Chief Running Bear, father of Joseph Crowfeather," Windrunner announced. "He wishes to speak with you directly." Sarah found herself face to face with the legendary Apache leader she had heard so much about. Despite his age, Running Bear radiated the same quiet dignity and intelligence she had observed in his son. "Healing woman," he said in careful English. "My son speaks of your courage and skill. You have risked much to help our people. Your son is a remarkable man," Sarah replied respectfully. "His recovery brings honor to your family." Running. Bear studied her with the same penetrating gaze she remembered from Joseph. "The soldier chief offers truce for healing. This is unusual among white men, who usually see only enemies or allies, never people who simply need medicine." "Lieutenant Parker is a good man trying to do his duty honorably," Sarah said. "I believe his offer is genuine." "And what of you, healing woman? If you return with the soldiers, what will become of your place among our people?" The question struck to the heart of Sarah's dilemma. Accepting Parker's protection might save lives in the immediate crisis, but it would also force her back into the white world she had chosen to leave behind. "I don't know," she admitted. "But saving lives today matters more than my personal future." Something in her response seemed to satisfy Running Bear. He nodded slowly, then spoke in Apache to Windrunner, who translated. "Chief Running Bear says that true healers always choose the welfare of their patients over their own safety. He accepts the soldier chief's truce offer, with conditions." "What conditions?" "The wounded will be moved to neutral ground where both Apache and white medicine people can work together. The soldiers will observe, but not interfere with treatment. And you will be free to choose your own path when the healing work is finished." It was a remarkable proposal, essentially creating a temporary medical sanctuary where traditional enemies could cooperate in preserving life. Sarah realized that this might be the beginning of the kind of bridge building between cultures that Joseph had spoken about. She returned to Lieutenant Parker with Running Bear's counter-proposal, watching the young officer's face as he considered the unprecedented situation. Never in the history of Apache cavalry relations had such a formal medical cooperation been attempted. "You're asking me to trust Apache warriors to honor a truce," Parker said thoughtfully. "I'm asking you to trust that healers on both sides want to preserve life rather than destroy it," Sarah corrected. "This could be an opportunity to prove that cooperation is possible." Parker looked around at his men, many of whom had been treated by Sarah and respected her judgment. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. We'll establish a neutral treatment area and maintain security while medical work proceeds. But I want your word that you'll cooperate fully with territorial authorities when this is finished." "You have it," Sarah agreed, though she wasn't certain what form that cooperation would ultimately take. Over the next several hours, an extraordinary scene unfolded in the desert valley. Apache healers worked alongside Sarah to treat wounded from both sides of the previous night's battle, while cavalry soldiers and Apache warriors maintained watchful but peaceful positions around the improvised medical camp. Sarah found herself serving as translator and mediator, explaining white medical techniques to Apache healers while learning traditional remedies that proved remarkably effective. The mutual respect that developed between the healing practitioners suggested possibilities for future cooperation that neither side had previously imagined. As the day progressed and the last patients were stabilized, Joseph arrived at the neutral camp despite his recent injuries. His appearance caused visible tension among the cavalry soldiers, who recognized him as a wanted Apache war leader, but Parker honored the medical truce and allowed him to observe the healing work. "You have given my people a great gift," Joseph said quietly to Sarah as they watched Apache and white healers working together to treat a wounded cavalry trooper. "We've given each other something valuable," Sarah replied. "The knowledge that healing can transcend hatred." As sunset approached, the time came for decisions about the future. Parker had fulfilled his promise to allow uninterrupted medical care, and now expected Sarah to honor her commitment to return with the cavalry patrol. But Joseph Crowfeather had a different proposal. "Healing woman," he said formally, speaking loud enough for both Apache and cavalry representatives to hear, "I offer you a place of honor among my people as medicine woman and keeper of sacred healing knowledge. You would be protected by all Apache clans and respected as a bridge between our worlds. The formal offer, made publicly before witnesses from both cultures, carried weight far beyond its personal implications. Sarah realized that her response would affect not only her own future, but the possibility of continued cooperation between Apache and white communities. Lieutenant Parker looked stricken. "Sarah, you can't seriously be considering abandoning your own people for a life among savages." "I'm considering where my healing skills can do the most good," Sarah replied quietly. "And Joseph's people aren't savages, Lieutenant. They're human beings with a sophisticated understanding of medicine, honor, and the preservation of life." The choice before her was clear, but not simple. She could return to the white world, face questioning about her activities among the Apache, and likely be reassigned to some distant post where her knowledge of frontier healing would be wasted. Or she could accept Joseph's offer and spend her life building the kind of medical cooperation she had witnessed today. "I choose to stay," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the silent camp. "My place is here, serving as a healer for anyone who needs care, regardless of the color of their skin or their tribal affiliation." Parker's face showed his dismay, but also a grudging respect for her decision. "Miss Mitchell, I pray you don't come to regret this choice." "I won't," Sarah said with certainty she felt in her bones. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." As the cavalry patrol rode away into the gathering darkness, Sarah stood beside Joseph Crow Feather watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. 7 years stretched ahead of them, years that would be filled with the sacred work of healing. The challenge of building trust between divided peoples, and the deepening bond between a white woman who had chosen compassion over convention and an Apache warrior who had offered her not just sanctuary, but a lifetime partnership in the most meaningful work either of them could imagine. The woman who had once been Sarah Mitchell, Army nurse, no longer existed. In her place stood someone new, a bridge between worlds, a healer without boundaries, and the beloved companion of a man who had shown her that the greatest courage lies not in taking life, but in dedicating oneself completely to preserving and honoring it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.